The Ukrainian army was conducting exercises near the country's northern border with Belarus, aimed at demonstrating its readiness to defend against a repeat of Russia's land invasion crossing the border. These exercises on the northern front followed warnings that the Kremlin was planning a new offensive because Russia uses Belarus as an attack platform. The Belarusian government denies this, but Russian troops are now heading back to Belarus as part of their unsuccessful effort to seize Kiev last year. As a result, tensions have increased in areas where Ukrainian forces are close to the border. One Ukrainian commander on this tense line stated that his troops were fully prepared, adding with a mocking smile that they had prepared many surprises for any Russian soldier who might try to cross the border again. Ukrainian Commander Kent did not elaborate on these surprises but made it clear that unlike 12 months ago, they have a fortified border that could prevent trespassing. Thanks to Ukraine's heavy equipment and even light armor, the trenches on the critical Belarusian border line resemble those from World War I. However, inside these trenches, the Ukrainian soldiers, ready for battle, have modern technology. Additionally, a large Ukrainian unit is now spread across the 650-mile border with Belarus, alongside those standing in the trenches. Ukrainian forces on the border are constantly vigilant to detect any new mass mobilization of Russian forces in the neighboring country. U.S. officials are also monitoring what they say is a steady flow of Russian troops and equipment in and out of Belarus on the closely observed border. Ukrainian officials declared that there are now about 30,000 Russian soldiers, only 10% of the pre-war number. Most of the forces at this border are probably east of this location, where the terrain is muddy rather than marshy. However, this does not mean that saboteurs and Russian infantrymen cannot cross here on foot. To better understand the possibilities, if we go deeper into the forest from this border line, we come across a small military camp. This camp is within walking distance of Belarus, and the Ukrainian troops stationed there are constantly monitoring this border camp for any suspicious activity. A Ukrainian soldier using the call sign Sturman, who was monitoring this camp, announced that he noticed something disturbing on his patrol a week ago. He said he saw a man in military clothing digging trenches and fortifications on the Belarusian side of the border. After receiving this information, in light of other dangerous situations, the Ukrainian armed forces took action and started blowing up the bridges on this border line in order to sever the connection of Russian soldiers with Belarus. With the alarm bells ringing, the Ukrainian forces began to organize simultaneous operations. First of all, the troops of the 120th Territorial Defense Brigade of Ukraine blew up the Slavutic connecting bridge on the border with Belarus. This stunning attack marked the beginning of operations to destroy bridges and crossings, which indicate that the armed forces of Ukraine intentionally destroyed possible routes through which military equipment could be transported. The flame of freedom ignited by Ukraine's 120th Regional Defense Brigade also spread to the Rivne, Volyn, and Zhytomyr regions. In these four regions, including Chernihiv, where the Slavutic bridge is located, Ukrainian forces blew up several bridges used by the Russians. In this way, the Ukrainians severely disrupted the connection of Russian troops with the Belarusian border. Following these operations, the armed forces of Ukraine started building a second line of anti-tank trenches in the Hrivnia region as part of the fortification reinforcement on the border between Ukraine and Belarus. Every day, Ukrainian soldiers were constructing fortifications and engineering structures, digging the second line of anti-tank trenches, and installing tetrahedron barriers using special concrete structures. Additionally, Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada announced that it has extended the border strip on the border between Russia and Belarus to a depth of 2 kilometers based on current legislation. Staying, residing, moving, trespassing, or engaging in any activity directly related to the defense or protection of the border itself is prohibited. The State Border Service of Ukraine stated that this area will be effectively equipped with landmines. Moreover, Ukraine has also established a system of engineering barriers in the border areas with Belarus, increasing their density tenfold, especially with mine explosives. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army announced that, in addition to all these measures, they have sent reinforcements to the Belarusian border. According to the Belarusian State Border Committee, the Ukrainian army has now assembled a group of 17,200 soldiers near the border with Belarus. If we take into account the soldiers on Ukraine's northern front, A total of 87,200 Ukrainian soldiers stand on high alert, ready for any counterattack along the Ukraine-Belarus border. The head of the Belarusian Ministry of Internal Affairs, Ivan Kubrikov, introduced the RES unit, which will participate in the fight against Ukraine's 87,200-strong border security, army, and sabotage intelligence groups. The main task of this unit is to combat sabotage and intelligence groups. RES is actively operating on the territory of Belarus. These are specially trained military personnel and consist of soldiers from the internal troops. Only soldiers serving under a contract are assigned to this section and are ready to work in any part of their country but face challenges against Ukraine's massive border army called the North Wind. The Belarusian RES group does not seem to be very effective. On the other hand, during this critical period when Ukrainian forces continued the construction of engineering barriers and detonated bridges, including minefields, Ukrainian soldiers continued to conduct regular exercises on the border, including the use of weapons. Ukrainian soldiers even participated in joint exercises with the armed forces, National Guards, border guards, and the security service of Ukraine on the Belarusian border amid the Russian offensive against Ukraine near the city of Chernobyl. The exercises have fueled speculation that Moscow could use its close ally and open a new front in the near future to launch a fresh attack on Ukraine from the north. The Belarusian administration, in a statement on this issue, stated that there is a significant Ukrainian military group massed near its border and warned that this poses a threat to its security. The Belarusian Ministry of Defense reported on Telegram that a significant group of the Ukrainian army is currently concentrated in the immediate vicinity of the state border with Belarus and the Ukrainian part. At present, the probability of armed provocations that could lead to border incidents has been consistently high. For this reason, it was stated that the armed forces of Ukraine will take measures to respond adequately but act in a measured manner. Alexei Polishchuk, a Russian Foreign Ministry official, announced that if Kiev decides to invade Belarus or Russia, Belarus could enter the war in Ukraine. In an interview with state media, Polishchuk stated that Russia's upcoming military exercises with Belarus are designed to prevent escalation and serve as a warning that Moscow's closest ally has the potential to join the war effort. Speaking to the Russian state-owned TASS news agency, Polishchuk stressed that from a legal standpoint, the use of military force by the Kiev regime, the occupation of Belarusian or Russian territory by the Ukrainian armed forces, would provide sufficient grounds for a collective response from Belarus. Kiev troops fearlessly advance towards the Russians as the front lines are ablaze. Western sophisticated weapons play a critical role in this advance of the Kiev troops. HIMARS rocket systems, one of the most critical parts of the indirect firepower of the American land forces, are successfully used by the Ukrainian army. HIMARS systems have a pod that carries 6 guided missiles of 227 mm. These systems were quite effective in changing the course of the Ukrainian war. In fact, the last success of HIMARS was recorded on the East Axis the other day. A tragic incident took place the other day in one of the divisions that were about to go on the offensive. For 2 hours, the Russian soldiers stood in the crowd somewhere, waiting for the division commander to speak his words of encouragement. But instead, HIMARS MLRs and Ukrainian artillery took the stage. According to Russian sources, the Ukrainian attack took place near Kremenny in the Luhansk Oblast. The target of the Ukrainian attack was the units and headquarters of the 20th United Arms Army. Russian forces and the headquarters of the Russian 20th Joint Arms Army were wiped off the map by the accurate firing of HIMARS missiles. After this attack, reports emerged that as many as 100 of Moscow's soldiers were killed and more than 200 wounded. This situation had a great impact in Russia. Russian writers spew their anger, saying that their armies are at war with their own stupidity and carelessness. In addition, Russian writers emphasize that Russian commanders do not seem to have learned from previous events and that those responsible should be shot. Ukraine has not officially confirmed the incident. However, an official said in a statement that they were in open air for 2 hours, enough to transport HIMARS, enter the coordinates, and shoot them. This was the big mistake of the 20th United Army General. An error large enough to facilitate the detection of Russian troops was heavily criticized by Moscow's pen. Situations like these have occurred many times in the chain of command of the Russian army. It's increasingly customary for soldiers or commanders to use telephones and allow them to be located. The loss of hundreds of Russian soldiers near Kremenna was not, in fact, the first tragic event to befall the Moscow army. As will be remembered, shortly after the new year, Ukrainian forces struck a compound housing hundreds of newly mobilized Russian soldiers in the occupied town of Makiivka in the Donetsk region. Russian authorities admitted that at least 89 people were killed. However, Ukrainian sources and many Russian war correspondents stated that the death toll was close to 400. Even the lower figure represented the largest official loss of life from a single attack since the start of the invasion by Moscow in February. As can be seen, counterattack operations have brought nothing but casualties for the Russian army for the time being. Now let's turn our route to the developments on the front lines. Ukrainian forces continue limited offensives on 3 fronts of the front, with potentially minor territorial gains near western Zaporizhia and Bakhmut. Russian troops are trying to launch a counterattack in the Makiivka region near the border of Zaporizhia and Donetsk. Russian forces increased unilateral ground and artillery strikes and airstrikes in eastern Ukraine while the Russian forces were not generally able to defend. Well, they retreated between tactical lines. Progress is slow due to minefields and obstacles, but that was to be expected. Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malier, one of the key spokespersons for the attack, said that soldiers in the south are facing minefields that prevent Russia from using anti-tank guided missiles and kamikaze drones. Anna Malier stated that there is a very serious conflict going on. Malier reported that they were making progress despite fighting strong resistance from Russian troops, including on the southern front. Ukrainian attacks on the northern flank of the city, namely around Dorachova, Vasilivka, and around the southern flank, Yashina, were reported with potential gains of 200 to 500 meters. It was reported that Russian counterattacks were repelled. Ukraine claims gains in an undefined zone of 300 to 350 meters. Despite all this, Russian President Vladimir Putin held a dubious press conference. President Putin tried to portray the image of a man in charge of a special military operation that will still be largely planned. During this meeting in the Kremlin the other day, Vladimir Putin made wild claims about Ukraine's losses and has even stated that he is considering retaking Kiev. Putin insisted that the Kremlin's goals remain unchanged while the blame for the large-scale invasion he launched last year is, as usual, on NATO and Ukraine. Putin claimed that Ukraine suffered heavy losses in the long-awaited counterattack while stating that Kiev's losses were 10 times greater than Moscow's. Also, the Russian leader claimed that Ukraine had lost 160 tanks and more than 360 other armored vehicles in recent days, but no other source has evidence to support it. Russia's own defense ministry recently announced that it has exaggeratedly captured several German Leopard tanks and U.S. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. The defense ministry has released video footage of it saying Russian troops are inspecting Western-supplied equipment. In the statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it was stated that the equipment of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Zaporizhia region was our reward. But the handful of vehicles in the video don't even come close to confirming Putin's claim total. It seems that Russian President Putin is trying to create a different perception towards his people. Besides his attempts to cover up his own soldier losses, we can say that Putin is doing his perception operation over the losses of Ukraine. On the other hand, among all Putin's comments, his statements about Kiev were perhaps the most eyebrow-raising issues. However, some videos published on social media destroyed Vladimir Putin's statements. Many sources showed how Russian tanks, armored vehicles, and soldiers were destroyed. For example, recent footage shared on social media shows a Ukrainian artillery brigade using smart artillery to destroy a Russian mortar. At the same time, the video shows how skilled Kiev is in its fight against the Kremlin. Footage shared by a War Watcher account U-Weapons shows a Russian Tuz-Fort Yulpan mortar being blown up by a Ukrainian bonus smart artillery. The footage shows the mortar shell rising in a large mushroom cloud as the Ukrainian offensive hits its target near Bakhmut, Ukraine. The image shared by a War Watcher account Blue Sarin in October 2022 showcases the value of smart systems in Ukraine. It depicts a Russian infantry combat vehicle standing in a stationary position on the roadside before being hit by a smart projectile and rising in a ball of fire and clouds of smoke. A second IFV sits on the roadway undamaged in the Ukrainian strike. Ukrainian forces shoot down a Russian IFV, presumably with a German Smart 155 artillery shell. As the videos show, Ukrainian forces managed to fend off the world's second-largest army. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin touched upon perhaps the only correct issue in his speech. Putin acknowledged that many things were missing during the special military operation: high-precision ammunition, communications equipment, and drones. The Russian leader stated that these equipments are available, but not enough. After all, Putin never expected his special operation to last longer than a few weeks. Now Russia is taking steps to address a shortage of weapons, particularly Iranian-made Shahd kamikaze drones. A representative of Ukrainian military intelligence said that the Kremlin plans to produce up to 150 Iranian kamikaze drones per month after establishing its own production facility on Russian soil. Kiev spokesman Andriy Yusov said Russia currently relies on weapons shipped from Iran via the Caspian Sea, but has recently announced plans that show Moscow has received the necessary materials to build its own factory. A Russian agent identified as working for the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation was arrested by the Ukrainian Security Service while trying to identify the areas where the Ukrainian army was deployed. The Russian agent assigned by Vladimir Putin has confessed to Vladimir Putin's new plan in Ukraine. Ukrainian citizens are being evacuated. In the last 6 months, 4 Russian agents have been captured on the territory of Ukraine. Ukrainian government officials have already stated that Vladimir Putin has sent a large number of Russian agents to the territory of Ukraine in order to get information about the Ukrainian army and to identify important areas before the Russian agent captured in Zaporizhia. Recently, another Russian agent was captured in the capital, Kiev. This Russian agent was caught by the Ukrainian security services while trying to locate energy infrastructure facilities in Kiev. The Russian agent was informing the coordinates of these energy facilities to the Russian forces, enabling the Russian military to launch airstrikes on these areas. However, the Russian agent did not realize that he had been under surveillance by the Ukrainian security service for 2 weeks. The Russian agent was caught near the power plant in Kiev, arrested and imprisoned by the Ukrainian security services. In his last statement, Vladimir Zelensky stated that they know that Russian intelligence agents were sent to Ukrainian territory by the Russian government and that they have formed special teams to catch these agents. Now, as the result of the intensive work of the Ukrainian security service, a Russian intelligence agent working secretly in Ukrainian territory has been captured. The task of these Russian agents sent by Putin to Ukraine was to identify important ammunition depots, energy and infrastructure systems, and the location of the Ukrainian army in the regions controlled by the Ukrainian army. One of these agents was recently captured by the Ukrainian security services in the Zaporizhia region while trying to locate Ukrainian army positions. The Russian agent, who was interrogated by Ukrainian security service chiefs, confessed to Vladimir Putin's new plan in Ukraine. As for the details of the news, the hot conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, which have been going on in the Zaporizhia region for a long time, have given way to a great silence. The Russian army, which managed to quickly occupy the Zaporizhia region in the first months of the war, is now only trying to protect the occupied territories. With the success of operations organized by the Ukrainian army in the Zaporizhia region, many regions of Zaporizhia have been liberated from Russian occupation. Vladimir Putin, who fears that the Ukrainian army will recapture the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, doubted this silence. An agent of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation appointed by Putin was secretly entering the areas of Zaporizhia under the control of the Ukrainian army and marking the positions where Ukrainian soldiers were stationed. The Russian agent who transmitted to the Russian army all these areas where the Ukrainian army was deployed and where the air defense systems were located was noticed by the Ukrainian security service teams and arrested in a short time. In the footage captured by the cameras, the Russian agent was dressed like an ordinary Ukrainian citizen. The confessions of the Russian agent who was interrogated by Ukrainian security service chiefs caused the Ukrainian government officials to be on red alert, confessing Vladimir Putin's plan for a new attack on Ukrainian territory. The Russian agent said that the Russian army would launch a new attack through the borders of Belarus. It was recently noticed by the Ukrainian intelligence service that many Russian headquarters in Ukrainian territory were evacuated, and the soldiers there were transferred to the Belarusian border with the images obtained from satellite images. The Russian agent admitted that tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been sent to the Belarusian border in the last month alone, and that many tanks and armored vehicles continue to be sent to Belarus. In the past weeks, the images taken by Russian people on social media caused a great panic in Ukraine. In these images, Russian trains were seen carrying a large number of tanks and armored vehicles. The Russian army is expected to enter Ukrainian territory from the borders of Belarus with a battalion of 100,000 soldiers and move to the capital, Kiev. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which took action with these confessions of the Russian agent, started to dispatch a large number of Ukrainian troops to the Belarusian border. Ukrainian soldiers who started taking defense lines and new positions on the Belarusian border are trying to increase security measures against any invasion attempt from here. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, upon learning that the Russian army was planning an attack through Belarus, asked the Ukrainians living on the border to leave the region and move to safer areas. Accompanied by Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian citizens are being taken from border towns and relocated to larger cities such as the capital Kiev. As security measures were increased in the town of Beryozov on Ukraine's border with Belarus, the people of the region started to support Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainian citizens, together with Ukrainian soldiers, started to build defense positions for border security. At the same time, Ukrainian soldiers who have placed many mines in the border towns plan to slow down the Russian soldiers here. The war between Russia and Ukraine, which has been going on for more than 15 months, has now reached a very different dimension. Putin, who managed to quickly continue his occupation of Ukrainian territory in the first months of the war, is now only trying to protect the territories he occupied. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, is making an intense effort to retake the territories where the occupation forces are located. When Russian leader Vladimir Putin realizes that he has started to lose his dominance in Ukrainian territory, he plans to change the course of the war by sending a large number of Russian intelligence officers to Ukrainian territory. The main reasons for the Russian army's rapid loss of power in Ukraine are the countries allied with Ukraine. The Ukrainian army, which put up a great resistance against the Russian army in the first months of the war, fascinated the whole world, while the whole world thought that the Russian army would occupy Ukrainian territory in a short time. The heroic Ukrainian soldiers managed to mislead everyone, with the US and Western countries providing military support to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has reached a very different dimension. As it is known, the Russian army is much stronger than the Ukrainian army in terms of army and inventory. For this reason, the Russian army was able to move very easily on Ukrainian territory. However, after the US and Western countries started to send more modern weapons and equipment to Ukraine, the Ukrainian army managed to equalize the situation, with the US agreeing to send new air defense systems and tanks to Ukraine in recent months. The battle has now turned in Ukraine's favor. The Ukrainian army's pressure in Zaporizhzhia has begun to frighten Vladimir Putin. Home to Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia is of great importance for Ukraine. For this reason, Zaporizhzhia was one of the first regions that Vladimir Putin occupied in Ukraine. The Russian army, which managed to seize the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility, stopped the energy flow to Ukraine. By stopping the activities here for a short time, Vladimir Putin, who planned to transfer the energy from here to Russia, stationed his own soldiers and engineers at the nuclear power plant. However, the fact that such a nuclear power plant was still operating while the war was going on posed a great threat. Many airstrikes by the Russian army were hitting near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility. As a result of entering the wrong coordinates, there was a great panic when one of the mortars sent by the Russian army hit the nuclear power plant. A red alert was sounded at the nuclear power plant and a leak was reported. The International Atomic Energy Organization contacted Vladimir Putin and asked him to send his teams to this nuclear facility. Otherwise, the slightest explosion at the plant could have caused major disasters. The explosion of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility would have caused a second Chernobyl disaster. Vladimir Putin initially rejected this request of the International Atomic Energy Organization, but later accepted this request and allowed the teams to conquer the Zaporizhzhia facility. As a result of the work carried out, the leak in the plant was fixed and the team was taken out of Ukrainian territory again.